of the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, this budget's already been termed by some of the commentators as a drab budget without any real pro-growth agenda. And this budget legislation, the first piece of budget legislation that the government is passing under urgency, is illustrative of how little of substance there is in this budget. It runs to 9 pages, although it's dropped on us under urgency without any forewarning. In the 5 minutes that I've had to study it, it's abundantly clear it's not a substantial piece of legislation that's going to affect the future growth prospects of our country, because it doesn't deal with the difficult issues. Mr Speaker, there are 3 parts to this legislation. The first part deals with, as the Minister has said, removing some tax credits. I think we've already heard the phrase that this budget picks the pockets of paper deliverers. Picks the pockets. I think it was Trevor Mallard said that first. It was a very good characterisation of this budget. Picking the budget of paper girls and paper boys up and down the country, ignoring the big issues that this country faces. Now, why do I criticise the fact that the taxation budget measures bill doesn't have more substantial measures in it? Well, the reality is that the government's own forecasts show that under current settings, they've had to downgrade their growth forecast. Not only have we already had the lowest growth in any government in the last 50 years for the period that this government has been in office so far, for this coming year, they've downgraded the growth forecast from 4% to 3%, and for the following year, they've downgraded it even more to 2.6%. So we've got lower growth than was previously projected. We've got lower employment growth than was previously objective, which has gone down from 170,000 new jobs to 154,000 new jobs over a 4-year period. So the growth in our economy is not as good as was previously predicted. In addition to that, we've got rising net international indebtedness, and the sort of measures that are needed to address that are a lot more substantial than those that are in this taxation bill. Mr Speaker, the government's own budget figures show that the current account balance gets worse every year from here. So under the current tax settings in this economy, our current account deficit goes from 3.6% of GDP negative this year to 6.7% negative in 2016, and it's negative every year in between. So the current account deficit gets worse every year. Now, what does that mean? That means that every year New Zealand has to sell more assets and borrow more money from overseas to bridge the gap, even after the government limps back into surplus in the government's books. They will not have dealt with the structural imbalances in our economy. What does that mean in terms of New Zealand's net investment liabilities in the world? What we owe to the rest of the world grows, and our net investment position goes backwards, so that by 2016, New Zealand's net international indebtedness, our net international liabilities, increased to 80% of GDP, 80.1. That totals an astounding $205 billion. $205 billion of net international liabilities by then, up from where it is currently this year at $134 billion. That is just about all private debt. It's not government debt. It's because we don't earn enough from our exports to pay for the cost of our imports and our interest. And what does this budget show? It shows that getting worse, not better. In terms of the pretty miserable GDP growth that we've got in this budget, just about all of it comes from residential investment. The great majority of it comes from residential investment rather than investment in our export economy and growth in exports. In fact, our growth in exports is miserable. We heard the Prime Minister today reading a speech that had been prepared some days ago saying that exports were up, on the very day that the Statistics Department said that exports are down by about $700 million compared with the same last year. No wonder this bill from the government is so narrow in its focus. There are some measures in it that we agree with. I agree. In fact, I was one of the ones with Stuart Nash that called for overhauling this rort that we had in the agricultural system, where you could change from revenue account to capital account for your livestock, your capital livestock. So what farmers could do is, if dairy prices were going up and they had 1,000 cows and those 1,000 cows were going to increase in value by $200 each, that would be $200,000 increase in their assets. And if it looked like they were going up in value, they could elect early enough to put it on capital account and they'd pay no tax on that increase in value. But if it was going the other way and dairy prices were going down, there could be a $200,000 decrease in their livestock, and they could put it on revenue account and claim a tax deduction and reduce their taxable income. That was a real rort. We called for its overhaul. We're glad to see that being fixed up. We also agree with changes to this abolition of the 10% bonus on early student loan repayments, because we opposed that when it was brought in because we knew it wouldn't work. This is the government reversing one of its own measures from just one of its recent budgets because it was so silly that 3 years later or 2 years later they're having to repeal it because it didn't work. So they were creating a 10% bonus for early repayments, and the only thing was they found that it wasn't getting any extra repayments. So they gave away their 10% voluntary repayment bonus for no increase in overall voluntary repayments. It's that sort of mismanagement of the economy which means that this government is not growing the economy in the way it should. Mr. Speaker, that's right. If we had performance pay in these ministries and on the part of the government, then there'd be a fair number of their ministers would be having a drop in salary, and they'd be earning less than backbenchers in the Labour Party because they're not as good as we are on this side. No, they won't do that for themselves, even though they're enforcing it upon the teaching profession. Mr. Speaker, this budget is a no growth in export budget. The export profile going forward is flat. As a consequence, the current account deficit goes up and New Zealand deficit goes up. The debt goes up and we have to sell more assets as well as borrow more money to meet that gap. Mr. Speaker, the fiddling around with the tax credits that were previously available to some low-income people is necessary in part because the government's income taxes cuts in prior budgets spent $2.5 billion per annum in respect of income tax cuts to the top 10% of income earners. I think, Mr. Cunliffe, was it 40% of the income tax cuts? The income tax cuts in that budget went to the top 10%. And as a consequence of the pressure that that's put on the government's finances, they're now having to take the small amount of tax break that a person doing a paper round used to get and taking that away from them. This taxation budget measures bill will do nothing to stop the flow of people to Australia. Indeed, the budget documents themselves show that New Zealand's changes in population and labour force assume that a large number of people continue to head to Australia for the next 2 or 3 years. They assume that we're going to be losing a large number of people. And as David Shearer said today, it was somewhat ironic to having the Prime Minister, before he was elected, saying that if he was elected, he was going to stop the equivalent of Westpac Stadium going to Australia every year. And now, of course, he'd have to make that same speech in Eden Park with some extra seats, because that's the number of people who are leaving. More than 1,000 people a week going to... What's that?
Have to bring back the temporary.
Bring back the temporary stands, yeah. That's right. The ones that they had up at the World Cup would have to be rolled out so that the stadium in Auckland could fit enough people to represent the number of people who are going to Australia in a year now, more than 1,000 people a week. Mr. Speaker, this budget has lower growth forecasts, lower employment growth forecasts, higher external debt, rising to over $200 billion, a $70 billion increase in external liabilities, net international liabilities over the next 5 years, a very, very narrow bill that doesn't do anything to cure the fundamental problems in the New Zealand economy.
Mr. Speaker, it's